All right. All right. Okay, you're all set, Jessica?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you again for all the coordination to prepare for tonight's event. I'm excited to join you all and share with you the recipe for an item that I've introduced at my different markets and events through my home bakery, Citrus Semolina Cakes, and they are vegan. There's no dairy or eggs in the recipe. We're going to talk a bit about the different ingredients. We're also going to walk through 3 different preps because there's the cakes, there's also the citrus syrup that the cakes soak in, and then we're going to candy some citrus fruit to use for decoration. And that's also just a nice technique to know because it's a lot easier than it might seem. And it's an example of something when you make it yourself, you're in control of the quality of the ingredients, you know exactly what goes into them, and it's just kind of a nice delight to decorate cakes or have as a treat. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. I'm curious if anybody is going to be working on the recipe while I talk through the recipe. Or no, I'm seeing some no's. Okay. I'm only asking, and feel free just to drop it in the chat or to unmute yourself because I'll make sure to do some modifications as we go just to slow down or speed up depending on where you are. But it sounds like we're all just more watching me go through the demo, which is wonderful too. And I can pause at any point if you have a question. We'll also have some time when the cakes are baking to talk through your questions as well. So the first thing that's really important to do when you're about to tackle a recipe, whether you're baking or cooking, is to set up a mise en place, which means everything in place in French. So I've gone ahead and done that. I'm just going to move my camera real quick so you can see. So I have already gotten my ingredients on my board ready to go. And with baking, I do recommend weighing your ingredients. You can get a pretty basic, nifty little kitchen scale. Not going to break your pocketbook, but will make a huge difference in your baking because unlike cooking, you may have heard, the precision really does make a difference when you're baking. If you add, some extra dashes of baking soda or don't add enough salt, that will make a difference. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly when you're weighing heavier ingredients like your flours and sugars. If you scoop with a measuring cup, it can get condensed and packed down, throwing off the actual weight when most recipes are created with weight in mind. So that's just a little tip. So the recipe that we shared ahead had both the weights and the measurements, just in case you don't have a scale. That's okay too. We're going to start with the dry ingredients and whisk them together, add in the wet, and then let them soak. I'm going to talk a little bit about why. But first, we'll do a little talk through of the ingredients that we're using. I don't know if anyone's used semolina before. So semolina is coarsely ground durum wheat. So the majority of wheat produced in the world is common wheat, like our all-purpose flour, which we're also going to be using. Semolina is often used in pasta and couscous. It has a higher protein and higher gluten, and so it provides more structure. Why it's interesting to use in cakes in this example is it can lend a pretty unique texture and it absorbs. I mentioned we're going to be making a citrus syrup. It's going to absorb that syrup more like a sponge. So it's going to take on the flavor and also get a lot more moist. So we are going to soak, once we mix the batter together, we are going to soak it for a little bit because we also want that coarser texture to soften. Now, if you think about, this can be more of a preference thing. Some people really like their cornbread, for example, and their corn muffins to have that grit. So it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if you like kind of a grittier texture. But for these cakes, we might not soak for the full 30 minutes like in the recipe just because of time tonight, but we are going to let it sit for a little bit. We are going to add in some nice orange zest and lemon zest. We are going to also add in some orange blossom water. Now I wanted just to show this ingredient in case you want to keep an eye out for it. I got it at Erox Market in Watertown, sold in Middle Eastern stores typically, and orange blossom water. So it's actually the blossoms are from bitter orange trees. So trees, for example, that grow Sevilla oranges, those are also called bitter orange trees. There is quite a floral scent, but I find the scent bakes out of it and it just lifts up the citrus flavor. So that's optional in the recipe, but it is an ingredient that can be fun to work with. I like for the plant-based yogurt, Coco June is just, not that this is a commercial, I'm just saying it is really rich. It has a really nice body to it. It's nice and thick. And this happened, I was able to get it at Costco, which was a nice deal. So I keep my eye out for good deals because I'm baking in bulk a lot of vegan treats for my bakery. But in general, I like to get plain unsweetened. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Because if you get sweetened, it's going to throw off, again, your recipe that already has sugar in it. And I don't like to, same reason I don't like it to get it flavored or vanilla. We're also adding vanilla extract. So just work with a blank canvas, and I tend to get coconut. For my plant-based milk, I have an organic, unsweetened, plain soy milk. This can a lot of times can come down to the allergies in your household as far as what you choose. And then for the fat, it's a nice organic olive oil. So this is a really, the end product is going to be a really nice, tender, dairy-free, egg-free cake. Through these ingredients, we're going to get body, we're going to get richness, and this sugar syrup is going to give it that nice moisture. So I'm going to pause, to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, I do have a quick question. I remember I had to take home economics eons ago, back in the 7th grade and 8th grade. And they taught us to aerate the flour before you start measuring out the cups if you were baking anything. And do you recommend that as well for this cake?
To aerate it. Can you say a little bit more about that?
It was basically what the home ec teacher did was she took a spoon and put it in like the flour canister and just stirred it up. She said that adds some air to it. Then she filled the cup with flour and then she knocked it against the table and said, see, look, and it did. The flour went down by like 1/8 of a cup. And she said, if you pack it in, it's going to be too much flour and the cake will be tough. So do you recommend aerating?
I think that's interesting. I mean, again, I'm so reliant on the scale now and the weights that I don't follow those different strategies as much, but I think it's worth a shot. And you might even try it with the scale and compare it and see for yourself as a little mini experiment what kind of difference there is in weight. I mean, another strategy I hear for folks who don't have, because I haven't heard that one, but this is part of the fun and why I wish we had home ec, because this is, such a great forum to share different ideas and approaches for cooking and baking, is to spoon in the flour into your cup and then level it off with a knife. Because again, like the aeration method that you're describing, you're avoiding that packing down, which is where, so often the ratios get thrown. Any other questions before we move on? No? Okay. So we're going to now combine the dry ingredients. One other thing to point out about the recipe that you received, one thing that I modified is I upped the salt a little bit. When I'm playing with recipes that I find online and I'm testing things out, sometimes I find the salt can be a little bit under. Sometimes I find it can be a little bit over for my preference. And in this case, I increased it from 1/4 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon. Because when I tested it, and this is true, I think for the home cook more than anything, and I'm just whisking right now, pulling it together. A lot of times we can get nervous at the very end. We put in so much time and care into preparing a dish. And because so many of us have had experiences of oversalted food and the panic that can come from that, we might overcompensate or undercompensate and not add enough. So with cooking, you just, you have that time at the end, add a little bit of salt, stir, taste your soup, your sauce, whatever you're making, until you find all the flavors come forward and pop. And, you might be making something with a lot of garlic, with a lot of wonderful herbs and spices, and feeling like it tastes bland. It's very likely the reason is it's under seasoned. It just needs the salt to pull all the flavors to the forefront. And the same thing's actually true with baking. We might not think of that as much with baking, but when I tasted the cake the first time I tried it from a recipe that I had found online, I thought, for everything that's going into this cake, I'm not getting enough of a citrus punch. And then sure enough, when I made it another time with double the salt, I found that the flavors did all come together. Okay, so we added all the dry ingredients. This is in the recipe, but just to reiterate, you're doing all of them except for the baking powder and baking soda, because we don't want those to soak in here. They're not going to be as effective with their activation. We're going to add them right before we put the cake into the pan. Okay, I'm just going to tilt my camera a little bit. Now adding in all the liquid ingredients. So that's the soy milk, olive oil already put in there, zest, the plant-based yogurt, vanilla, and the orange blossom water. Whisking that together. You know, typically I'm just making sure it's all combined, and I'm also whisking out any of the lumps. But there's nothing to be gained by over mixing it. We're not using eggs, which sometimes when you're using eggs in non-vegan baking, you're supposed to whisk it extra because it aerates, but that is not something that we're going for here. So now that it's combined, I can just let it sit. And again, this is where the mise en place, I'm telling you, it really helps. I already measured out the baking soda and the baking powder. And I even put them over there because I don't want to be distracted and by mistake, you know, not follow the recipe. That is what it's there for, is just to have everything set up so that you feel organized and in control. So now that part of the recipe is done. And we can move on to talking a little bit about the other preps that are going to be involved. So my oven is already preheated. It sounds like I'm the only person baking these in real time. So I got that preheated already. And then this is another little modification I did for this recipe before selling it in my bakery, is I really like the idea of selling mini cakes so that, you know, when people come by, they can have their own special treat, or they can bring it to a friends or families as a gift. And so instead of making it in one round, I'm making it into these individual, these are called springform pans because they have a spring that pops out. And that's super, super helpful because with more delicate cakes, all you need to do after it's cooled a bit is release the spring and let them sit, and then just lift them off of this bottom pan, where it can get a lot trickier when you're trying to invert them. And if it's a delicate cake, you can break them. So one recipe makes 4 of these mini cakes, and I also put in some parchment rounds. So you can buy parchment in big sheets. You might already do that for even roasting vegetables. When making cake pans, you can cut them into rounds. Because I'm baking a lot at once, I go ahead and buy pre-cut rounds that fit the size of my pans. And so this all prevents the cake from sticking. And then I just go over with a little bit of a baking spray, a quick spray. And now I can feel confident that the cakes will be able to get out of the pan. So let's talk about how to make candied citrus slices. So I recommend, although it's fine if you don't, you know, if you wanted to give this a shot and you had a bunch of navel oranges in your fridge, that's totally fine. They're just a lot bigger. So especially for making smaller cakes that I want to decorate, it makes so much sense to use smaller fruit. But even on a larger cake, I have some fun, I think, with smaller slices, being able to play a little bit rather than having the bigger slices. Same thing if you are just candying these citrus slices to have as a treat or to give as a gift. I think mandarins and clementines are the perfect size. So these are mandarins. They're organic. I think I got them at Trader Joe's. I do recommend, because we're eating the rind, same thing for the zest in the cakes. That I noted preferably organic, since we're going to be eating this peel. Now, as far as thickness, I'm slicing about a quarter of an inch. You don't want them too thin because they can break apart in the water. And you don't want them too thick because it's just not as, it's going to take a lot longer for them to candy, and they won't be quite as delicate looking. I did try using a mandolin once to do this, which is an awesome kitchen tool to have. But I found that with these small citrus fruit, they kind of jammed up the works a little bit. And at the end of the day, it's not that hard to slice uniform fruit slices.
Oh yeah, and Jessica, are you going to be keeping the ends of the oranges, or just the ones that don't have rind on them, like the center slices?
I'll be candying everything except these little ends.
Oh yeah, okay, so that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I might just squeeze those in water. You know, I mean, literally, if I was just in here working, I have a glass of water somewhere, I'd probably just squeeze it and toss them in just for flavored water, so they're not wasted, and then compost them.
Okay, okay.
So can you, yeah, good, you can all see. So this is the 3 cups of water. And the sugar.
And Jess, would it work with some other sweetener like maple syrup or barley malt or rice syrup, do you think?
Question, non-refined. I really like that question. I haven't seen a recipe for that. I'll look into it. I think that's a great idea. I'm wondering if, because part of the recipe of making candied fruit is to be very careful that the sugar doesn't caramelize, because then the fruit kind of turns brown and it affects the color. I work with coconut sugar a lot in baked goods, and it does give off that kind of caramel appearance. So that would be my only thought, but I imagine there's got to be recipes out there. If you don't want it, especially if you're flexible about how the final product looks and you're more interested in what you're taking in. So I'm just stirring this to dissolve. I'm going to bring it back down to medium. We're just dissolving the sugar. I'm going to slice some more mandarins. And any other questions while we're waiting for the water and sugar to dissolve?
See, any more questions, anyone?
Has anyone ever had a semolina cake before?
No, I haven't. Not that I know of anyway. Oh yes, is this cake supposed to be of some type of ethnic cuisine like Italian or Greek, do you know?
That's a great question. So yes, so it's inspired by Mediterranean cakes, Greek and Italian. That again, semolina is used in the cooking more in Mediterranean diet. So you also find it more in the sweets and desserts, as well as North African cuisine and Moroccan, Middle Eastern cuisine as well. So I'm curious, when folks bake vegan at home, what kinds of fats do you tend to use to replace dairy?
I use olive oil.
Yeah.
I usually use sunflower oil because it has a neutral taste.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've started, originally I wasn't sure if olive oil would be too strong. Similar, I would lean more towards sunflower. But then I found some mild olive oil. I tested it in a pumpkin bread this fall, and I found that the flavor was neutral. And I'm so excited because it's so good for us. So I think for me, I've used usually olive oil or organic coconut. And I've had good results. I think coconut and chocolate go really well together.
Yeah. Oh, from Lady D. Okay, Diane, I sent out the recipe yesterday with the link. Did you get that? Oh, okay, yeah, you're on mute. Diane, you're on mute.
Did you say on the website, it would be on the website?
No, I sent it with the did you get the registration link the Zoom link yesterday?
Uh, I must have if I get on, right?
Okay, well, it's a link to a Google Doc.
Okay, all right, thank you. I missed that
Okay.
probably.
I'll
Thank
send
you.
it out after the presentation too.
All
Again,
right,
send
thank
the
you.
Google Doc again. Okay. Any other questions?
So the sugar is just about dissolved. Probably another minute. I brought out some, these are some slices that I had kept in the freezer. Just to give you a sense of the finished product, because these will take about 45 to 60 minutes to become candied, and we won't be on the phone on the Zoom together that whole time. So I wanted to give you a sense of that. We'll talk a little bit more about what you're going for in the finished product. But another benefit is that between pieces of parchment paper, you can keep these in your freezer for a few months. You can keep them in the refrigerator, and they'll stay really intact and in good condition. So now I have a sugar water. It's completely dissolved. And I'm going to drop in these slices. And the big thing is, it's okay if they touch a little bit, but you don't want them really overlapped. You want them to have some space between them.
Oh, wow. Nice. Looks good.
And because I just added a bunch of cold slices, now the heat is, the temperature of the water's dropped, so I have to bring up the heat because we're trying to get it back to a simmer. Once we get it to a simmer, I'm going to get the heat just in that sweet spot, so it's a light simmer. We just want a low simmer. Again, if we boil them, they're just going to break apart. And the sugar can caramelize, and we'd have to start all over again. But if we keep them at a nice low simmer, they'll be gently cooking and candying within an hour. You'll have your finished product. And what you're going to go for is you want them to be translucent. And the rind won't ever be translucent, but it's more that the white kind of disappears, it fades away and turns into just more of an opaque orange around the circle of the fruit slice. So there you have that. Any questions before we go back to our batter? Okay. So the batter has thickened a bit because now the semolina has absorbed the liquid. And it's softened a bit. Now we can add our leavening agents, the baking soda, the baking powder, and I'm just gonna go ahead and stir that in, scraping down the sides. It's really a beautiful golden color too. And when it bakes, it deepens even more. It's really lovely. So I'm gonna bring the pans over. And again, this is just what's so nice when you have everything set up and ready to go. It brings a sense of control and confidence that people don't always associate with cooking and baking, but if you have everything ready, that's really the name of the game. So I really swear by using ice cream scoops. They're great for everything. You know, a lot of times folks use them for muffins and cupcakes. You can use them to make cookie dough balls, but I really use them for everything, even a more liquidy cake like this one. So I have the oven temperature set to 350, but I set it to convection mode versus convention mode. Does anyone have a convection option on their oven?
No, could you explain this?
Sure. So they're referring to where the heat's coming from. So like in a traditional oven, it's usually convention. And the heat is coming from, I think typically the top or the bottom. I have a 50-50 chance of being right. I'm gonna guess the bottom. With a convection, there are fans and it's swirling the heat all around. So that can be a benefit also in not only in speeding up your cooking time, but in some kinds of baking, for example, when you're making a pie, that blast of heat and even baking can lead to a really flakier pie crust. It also means that you can use multiple racks in your oven. With a little bit more even cooking, but you really do still need to, if you're using all 3 racks, switch them to, because every oven has a hot spot. And you just want to make sure that all of your cakes or cookies are browning evenly. So when you are cooking or baking, let me just pop these in. I'm going to put them in the middle rack. And I'm only putting it in for 15 minutes.
Oh, Tara, I like your use of the ice cream scoop to fill the cake pans from Tara Wallace.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway. And then you can just rinse it off and put it in the dishwasher, which just feels nice. When you really get in the swing of it too, you can think like, oh, I know exactly how many scoops I need for each pan. And they really help with making even cookie dough balls and muffins too. So with the convection oven, if you're following a recipe, recipes typically in the States are written for convention, and you're using a convection setting, you either need to bake for a shorter amount of time, or you need to adjust the temperature 25 degrees lower. So if the original recipe says 30 minutes, I would set my convection to 325. Maybe I want that swirling heat and that more, even browning effect on multiple racks. But I need to adjust the recipe. In this case, I kept it at 350, but I'm lowering the amount of time. And in that case, you usually want to knock like 10 to 15 minutes off. So it's going to bake faster, which is nice, especially when you're doing a timed live cooking demonstration. So that's only 15 minutes. I'm just going to let it bake. And then in the meantime, I'll show you the third prep, which is making the citrus syrup. So the recipe has both lemon and orange juice, and then it has, again, the weight amount as well as the liquid measuring cup amount. I'm just stirring to dissolve the sugar. And I'm being gentle about the stirring too. If I start whipping the sugar around in the pan, it can form little crystals around the edge, and we don't want that. So I'm just being gentle. And just like we did for the sugar water for the candied fruit, I'm keeping an eye on it. I want to just cook it until it reaches that point where the sugar dissolves. And then I'm going to let it go for 1 more minute because we're making a syrup. We do want it to start to coagulate a bit. The technique we're going to use is you take us, once the cakes come out of the oven, let them sit for a minute, a couple minutes, and then take a skewer and poke holes all over the cake. And then pour in with a spoon the syrup. And it might seem like a lot of syrup. I don't know if anybody on the call has made babka before. I always have that experience when I'm making a babka. There's also sugar syrup you pour onto it right after it's come out of the oven. And it always seems like so much. And it's like, really? But then if you've had the experience of holding it back and thinking there must be something wrong, you do find it's not as moist. And that's exactly the effect if you don't follow this recipe. So, have faith, poke holes all over the cake, not just in the middle, let it sink in and absorb. And then when they're totally cool, you can take them out of the pans. So the sugar syrup's now done. And it's a beautiful citrusy smell. I'm taking a peek at the mandarin slices. And something I'm noticing is a lot of the bubbling is happening in the back of the pan. So I'm just rotating it a bit to make sure that they're all getting the same amount of heat. And that's where we're at. So there's about 10 minutes left on the cake, but I guess again, just a pause to see if there are any thoughts or questions.
Yes, just when you make this sugar syrup, can that be with any kind of juice, or is it just like a general syrup recipe, or I don't know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd probably look it up just because of the amount of acid and the tart flavors of the juice we're using, the ratio to sugar. But yeah, definitely. There are all different kinds. That actually reminds me. There are also different fruit syrups sometimes made for beverages as well. And because of that, the sugar syrup that you make when you're making the fruit, which is very similar as we talked about, get back to your question, Sarah, the syrup we made when we're making for the cake, you can save it. So this is the leftover clementine orange syrup from candying fruit, just from the last couple times I've made these cakes for markets. and I just put it in a jar, label it, and put it in my fridge, and it'll be great for cocktails or mocktails. You could have it even just like in some sparkling water with some slices of citrus. Or get creative with it in a seasonal cocktail. I haven't tried either yet, but I'm glad to have it stowed away in my fridge to play with. And you might see different flavored simple syrups like blackberry, berries a lot of times are macerated and made into sugar syrups for drinks as well.
Yes, and have you also tried this with other sweeteners?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, this is only this winter when I've been exploring this cake and using this syrup. But I'm also you're asking great questions about that. I'm very curious coming away from this call. I haven't used anything but the recipe that I'm sharing with you tonight. And because of the kind of the science behind it, I would want to follow a recipe and see what's out there for using non-refined sugar to make these different syrups.
Okay.
It's great.
Yeah. Cindy, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, I just wondered because you were off mute. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, and oh yeah, just if you are making this as a large cake,
Yeah.
what would you do differently? I mean, like, do you
Yep.
still use a springform pan?
Yep. So you could use a springform pan or you could use a round cake pan. The recipe has the different techniques to follow if you're going to be using a larger pan. So the first thing out of the gate is you'd need to bake it for longer than we're baking these smaller cakes. And then between the springform and the round cake pan, when you're using the springform pans, you can go ahead and soak them in the sugar syrup while they're still enclosed, unlatch them as you go. It's a little bit more of a relaxed process. When you're using a round cake pan, you want it to stick. So there's some instruction for maybe inverting it beforehand. They're also going to become more delicate once they have all that yummy syrup in them. So that's another consideration of why you'd want to invert it first.
Okay.
And parchment paper really is a life changer. Not to be dramatic, but I'm a baker. So when you are trying to prevent sticking, you can get, and you can compost them. If you get, I typically get parchment paper that's made from wood pulp, and then I tear it up into strips and I put it in my compost bin as a brown.
Oh, okay. Good to know. And oh, one thing is I also remember about using a lower temperature is reading in the Sierra Club magazine. They often have tips about things you can do around the house. And because glass is a really good insulator, they recommend that if you are baking with a glass dish, to lower your temperature 25 degrees. And I found out that it does help. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah. Glass is my preferred for so many reasons, and what I use for my chef clients too, when I recommend containers to store their meals. But yeah, you have to be very careful going from freezer to, thinking about temperatures to a fridge and then to oven as well.
Yeah. Or what is it? I know it says on all of the instructions whenever you buy a glass dish is make sure it warms to room temperature before you put it in the oven, because otherwise it could crack.
Yes.
You put something very cold in there.
A really good rule of thumb.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Zero Waste Chef or any of the, there's so many great resources out there now for home bakers, home cooks, professional bakers and cooks to reduce waste in their kitchen. I'm actually curious. I belong to Zero Waste Melrose here in my town. If any of you have any good resources for chefs and bakers who are trying to minimize their waste in their business.
I don't know about here in Boston. Does anyone else know?
I think that's a room for growth, honestly, because I've been trying to find resources, but it doesn't maybe there's some forum out there, but I haven't, since starting my business a year and a half ago, been able to find even an online community that is sharing ideas. So I always ask.
You mean like a compost?
Well, that would be an example, but yeah, like different ways to reduce waste, different containers to use that are non-toxic. I mean, it's pretty intuitive when you're a home cook and baker, you know, what's non-toxic, but also when you're baking and cooking in large quantities, it's like plastic is always the default in professional kitchens. And how do we get out of that cycle? What are the alternatives? And sometimes it starts with good ideas from home cooks. But part of the beauty of having a home bakery is I do have a compost out back. I love gardening, so I'm able to use that. I hear you. That was like the first thing that I really committed to. Yeah. You can see that they've risen up quite a bit. They're very cute. I did move them to the lower rack because, again, even though it's on convection, I found there's some hot spots in my oven. So I just want to make sure that they're getting fully browned all around and also underneath. And they've risen quite a bit. But what I'm looking for, a couple things. I think you probably saw they're still loose. You can tell the batter's not totally baked through. And we also want to see more of a golden brown top. And there's still that kind of lovely corn color. Which, by the way, it's very easy to mistake semolina for corn flour. They look very similar and the color is very, very similar as well. But semolina is from durum wheat, which is, whereas common wheat is like 80% where we get all-purpose flour of wheat production. Durum is less than 10%. It's not nearly, not even close as commonly used. But it's unique, and it's part of the fun of baking to experiment with different kinds of flours.
Oh, so do you also experiment with other flours, like say rice flour? Oh wait, I didn't find the recipe in the email. Okay, just a moment. Diane, I'll be sending it out afterwards.
Okay.
And thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
I do, because I have a bakery that caters to special diets. I always have on the menu gluten-free options as well. And I use rice flour quite a bit, both regular rice flour and sweet white rice flour, which is, you might know if you've tried some different Japanese desserts like mochi, that kind of spongy texture comes from sweet rice flour. So I use a combination, for example, for my brown butter chocolate chip cookies. They're not vegan. They're a popular gluten-free treat. Gluten-free oat flour, sweet rice flour, white rice flour, and tapioca because no one flour is going to replace flour that contains gluten. So you really need to use a combination in order to achieve all of the things that gluten can achieve. I have a lot more and more requests for sweets that are both vegan and gluten-free. And for that, I have found using almond flour, I've had a lot more choices that lead to really satisfying desserts that are also made from all whole food ingredients at the same time. So that's been a lot of fun to explore.
Yeah.
And to make it paleo, I might add in some cassava flour or some coconut flour as well.
Have you ever tried flax seeds to substitute for eggs?
Yes, and chia. Yep. And see, this is where I think plant-based baking is so wonderful for me. That for my own personal baking, I most like to have plant-based sweets at home, because if it's a sweet that I feel like I'm getting nourishment and nutrition from, that's just a win-win. And flax seeds are so good for us. Chia seeds are so good for us. So to use them as an egg replacement and to have that added nutrient dense benefit is I think is really great. Yeah. So I would say just a couple more minutes. I'm a little bit of a cookbook addict. So I did bring just a couple to class to show you. And speaking of plant-based treats, so I shared with Sarah my favorite, I'd say one of my top 3 favorite vegan plant-based blogs is called Rainbow Plant Life. Chef Nisha has South Asian descent, so she actually also happens to have some of the best curry recipes I've ever tried or seen. But even though I'm working on not buying as many cookbooks, I finally relented last weekend. She just came out with this gorgeous book. And I think a lot of the recipes are available for free on her site. If you want to check it out, we can share the website with you. But this is just so beautiful. I had to go for it. And her recipe for breakfast cookies, I used and then played with and then made my own to sell a vegan, gluten-free cookie that's actually not made with any of the major allergens. So there's also no nuts in it, for example. There's no coconut, but there's tons of seeds. Sunflower seeds, sunflower seed butter, hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, and so forth. And the base recipe that inspired me was from her blog. So that's definitely something that I would check out. She uses flax seeds quite a bit. Okay, so we're very close, if not there. So at this point, the way to really check is by doing the toothpick test. Here are our cakes. Now I'm just seeing, I'm looking at them. I'm like, okay, I think, a couple of them have some golden brown spots and a couple of them don't. So I'm not sure. Let's see. Okay, so good so far. So that toothpick is totally clean. Same. Yep. Okay, so that's telling me we're good. The citrus slices are still doing really well too. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to poke holes. All around. So you can see I'm really, I'm covering the all around surface of the cake. And with the syrup, like this is something you don't want to make the syrup in the morning and then come back a few hours later. You want the syrup to still be a little bit warm, which is why it's really perfect to make it while the cakes are baking. So I'm just, you can see, really dousing these guys.
So it's what, like, would you say 3 or 4 tablespoons per cake?
That's a good, yeah, that sounds about right. You could take a look at it more exactly by taking a look at the recipe and then just dividing it if you're doing these little ones by 4. But I'm just going around and I am making sure they all get it all around the edges too. And that's what I mean. See, there's still, I'd say like 2.5, 3 tablespoons left. And these guys are shiny with citrus syrup, but keep going. just about done. The last thing I'll do is just, because it kind of can sometimes pool a little bit in the center. So I'm just tilting to make sure that it just runs down the side instead of pooling in the middle. And there you have it. Let's just let them sit for a couple minutes and I can probably snap one out and see how that goes. Usually I would let them sit longer, but it'll be fun to take a look. The other cookbook that I also just wanted to give a shout out to is Vegan Omicron. So Isa Chandra Moskowitz also has a series. So she wrote this book with Terry Hope Romero. Isa Chandra Moskowitz has a restaurant in Brooklyn called Modern Love. And if any of you are on social media and or want to check out her website, just the pictures of the vegan food she creates is really stunning. Even in Veganomicon, even though there's a lot of meals, the back section has fantastic baked goods as well. And what I've done is a lot of, she was pretty cutting edge when these books came out. There is a lot of use of canola oil in some of the recipes. So I just switched those out for olive oil or coconut oil, and it hasn't impacted any of the recipes. So if that's your preference, that's just one thing to name. And then she also has a series of baking books dedicated to cookies, another one to cupcakes, and another one to pies. So those are fun to check out too. So at this point, just to also point out with my orange slices or my clementines, I'm going to flip them over. They're not crowding each other, which is great. You can see it still has a ways to go, but it's definitely getting there. And then when the time comes, which will probably be after our call, so I just want to point it out. I have over here set up a wire rack with a piece of parchment paper underneath. And I will lay the slices on the wire rack and I'll let them dry overnight. They should actually sit there for like 24 hours. They'll get a little bit, they'll dry out, but they'll still be a little tacky, like gummy candy. But you do want that moisture to dry out. And then they'll be good to go. And then these are two, we're making a citrus cake. So I had to give shout outs to a couple gadgets that are really helpful. This is a microplane zester that makes life so easy when you're when you want to zest a fruit. And you can just hold it and zest like this on top of a plate, and it's very, very, very smooth glide. And then some of you might already have these hand juicers already. I saw a really good tip that I've been using ever since, to use a wider bowl and to squeeze it sideways. And also, like with a lemon, I've noticed especially, before you juice your fruit, slice off the end just a little bit, like even 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, then cut it in half. And then when you juice, you can juice one side of it, flip it over, and juice the other. And you get all the juice that would have been stuck. You get all this extra juice because now you've just sliced off that peel and you have the fruit on both sides. And I found that I didn't even realize how much how much juice I had been wasting before trying that. Okay. So this is a little bit of experiment because it is still warm, but I want to it'd be fun to be able to give you a little bit of a visual. So here's your little cake. Pretty
Cute.
adorable.
Yeah.
So cute. I won't take that added risk of trying to take it off because I think it will break warm, but because it has that slice of parchment and we also greased the tin, it'll come off no problem at all. And then when the time comes to decorate it, you can place a piece of fruit in the center. You could kind of play around with them a little bit and overlap them if you'd like. But like I said, this sized fruit with the size cake, just one in the center, I think is very elegant and very enticing too. They really catch customers' eyes from across the room. And as always, it's very exciting to see when a customer comes and they say, do you have anything vegan? If they're not familiar, and to say, oh yeah, these cakes are, and just the joy of it not feeling like an afterthought when creating plant-based and vegan desserts. They can be just as beautiful and satisfying and delicious. So this was fun baking with you all. Thank you for having me.
All right. Jessica, thank you so much for giving us this presentation. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You explained everything so clearly. You were engaging. The cakes look great. I wish I could have one.
No, that's the only drag about doing this on Zoom. I wish you could do.
All right. Any more questions before we go? Any questions for Jessica before we leave? Okay, I will stop recording.